In her 1971 memoir, Joan Crawford wrote that 3 failed marriages were the most terrible, heartbreaking, anguishing experiences anyone could have, and they get worse each time. That is a striking thing to put in a book under your own name. But Joan Crawford was always honest about the parts of her life she chose to be honest about. 4 marriages, a man from Hollywood royalty, a Cornell-educated theatre intellectual, a decent actor she married 6 weeks after meeting him, and finally, a Pepsi-Cola executive who she said gave her the most blissful years of her life. None of the first 3 ended well. The 4th ended in a mourning she would never entirely recover from. This is that story. The girl who invented herself. She was born Lucille Fay LeSueur, probably on March 23, 1906, in San Antonio, Texas. Even her birth year is uncertain. She later claimed 1908. Studios used various dates, and the confusion was largely of her own making. The uncertainty suited her. Joan Crawford was, from the beginning, a construction. She built herself the way she built her career, with total deliberateness, leaving as little of the original material visible as possible. Her father, Thomas LeSueur, a French-Canadian labourer, left the family when Lucille was still an infant. He simply did not come back from a job one day. Her mother, Annabelle Johnson LeSueur, moved with her 2 surviving children, Lucille and her older brother Hal, to Lawton, Oklahoma, where she married Henry Cassin, a man who ran the local Ramsey Opera House. As a small child, Lucille was renamed Billy Cassin after her stepfather and was allowed to watch the performers from backstage: dancers, vaudeville acts, traveling comedians, the theatrical world in miniature. The backstage hands smeared grease paint on her face and taught her to dance. The seed of everything that came later was planted in those wings. The Cassin household collapsed when Lucille was around 11. Her mother discovered that Henry Cassin had been in a deeply inappropriate relationship with Lucille that had begun when the girl was still a child. The marriage ended. The family moved to Kansas City. Lucille found herself at St. Agnes Academy, a private Catholic school, where her fees were paid by working. She cleaned, she cooked. She served the other girls in ways that made the social hierarchy of the school brutally clear. She was the girl who washed the plates that the other girls ate from. She later described the experience of not being treated as an equal by the girls around her because she worked for her own keep. She became depressed and tried to run away at least once. Eventually, she transferred to another school, Rockingham Academy, with similar arrangements. The lessons about class and status that she absorbed in those schools did not leave her. After completing the equivalent of secondary school, she attended Stevens College in Missouri, briefly, for a matter of months, before the pull of dancing and the theatre made sitting in a classroom feel impossible. She left. She joined a traveling dance troupe. She worked as a telephone operator, then for various clothiers, then returned to the chorus line because it was the one thing that felt like progress rather than marking time. She was a dancer. That was what she had and what she used. After working her way from Kansas City to Chicago, arriving with $46 in her pocket by her own account, she won a part in a traveling company and eventually landed in New York. She was in the Broadway production of The Passing Show of 1924, working in the chorus, and it was there that an MGM talent scout spotted her. She initially turned down the offer of a screen test. A stage manager talked her into taking it. She took it, left for Kansas City for Christmas, and on Christmas Eve, 1924, received a telegram from Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer offering her a contract at $75 a week. She borrowed $400 for travel expenses and arrived in Culver City, California on New Year's Day, 1925. She was nobody. She didn't even have a name yet that was hers. The studio thought Le Sourd sounded like a sewer and held a contest in Movie Weekly to find her something better. The result was Joan Crawford. She reportedly hated it. She thought it sounded like crawfish, but she became it so completely and with such commitment that the original name was almost entirely erased. Her early years at MGM were the years of the grinding upward kind of ambition that doesn't leave room for much else. Her first roles were small and uncredited. She was a body double for Norma Shearer, MGM's reigning female star, who happened to be married to studio head Irving Thalberg. And she found that particular humiliation difficult to absorb quietly. She practiced her speech relentlessly to eliminate her southern accent. She attended every dance at every hotel in Hollywood, winning Charleston competitions, being seen, being noticed, working the social circuit the way a soldier works a position. There was nothing casual about it. She was not going to be overlooked a second time. By 1928, she was a star. Our dancing daughters established her as the definitive flapper of the silent era, modern, uninhibited, unapologetically alive in a way that audiences in the late 1920s were hungry to see. The studio couldn't ignore her anymore. She had made herself impossible to ignore. By the early 1930s, her fame was rivaling MGM colleagues Norma Shearer and Greta Garbo, the two women who had once seemed entirely out of her reach. She was one of the highest paid women in the United States. The rags to riches stories she played on screen, the working girl who finds love and success, resonated with Depression-era audiences who understood what it meant to want more than what you had. In some ways, she was playing her own life, or the version of it she had decided to present to the world. And then, at the peak of that first great wave of recognition, she fell in love with a young man whose surname was already famous in ways hers was not yet. What followed was the first of 4 marriages, and the one that would teach her the most fundamental lesson, that being Joan Crawford and being someone's wife were not always compatible ambitions. The first marriage, Douglas Fairbanks, Jr. Douglas Fairbanks, Jr. was the son of Hollywood royalty. His father, Douglas Fairbanks, Sr., was one of the biggest names in silent film, a man who represented the glamour and physical heroism of early cinema in the most public possible way. He had co-founded United Artists with Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, and D.W. Griffith. He and Mary Pickford were married and lived at Pickfair, their mansion in Beverly Hills, which was effectively the social headquarters of Hollywood's upper tier. To be welcomed at Pickfair was to have arrived. Junior had grown up inside all of that, with a name that carried enormous weight and the particular pressure of being expected to live up to it while simultaneously establishing his own identity. He was charming, handsome, well-read, and genuinely interested in the world beyond the film industry. He liked books. He liked theatre. He had a European quality, a Polish that came from travel and education, that the girl from the Kansas City chorus line found genuinely compelling. He represented a kind of world that Lucille Le Sourd had always been looking at from the outside, and now suddenly the door was open. They married on June 3rd, 1929, at St. Malachy's Roman Catholic Church in New York City. Joan was in her early 20s. Douglas was not quite 20. In her memoir, she described them as both being teenagers, not quite accurate in years, but entirely accurate in spirit. They were two young people whose public identities were still being constructed around them, both still in the process of figuring out what they were. The complications were there from the start. Douglas's father, the elder Fairbanks, by then ensconced at Pickfair with Mary Pickford, was unenthusiastic about the match. Pickford, whose own carefully maintained image of sweetness and propriety was important to her professionally, was similarly reserved. Joan was not the kind of girl that the Pickfair set would naturally have chosen for Douglas. She had come from nowhere. Her past was murky. Her persona was manufactured. And the rumours that circulated about her earlier years, some of which were probably true and some probably not, did not help. She found herself on the margins of the family she had married into, welcomed in some rooms and quietly excluded from others. For a woman who had spent her entire life fighting to be included, this was not a position she found easy to occupy with grace. The marriage also collided head-on with the problem that would eventually sink every one of Joan Crawford's marriages: the career. Joan was becoming one of the most popular actresses at MGM. Douglas was a young actor trying to establish himself in the shadow of a famous father, working steadily, but without the specific combustibility that Joan had with an audience. She was ascending at a rate that he could not match in those years, and the gap between their trajectories created a pressure that neither of them fully acknowledged openly, but that both of them felt. She later described the central tension in clear and honest terms. She wanted Douglas, but she also wanted work. And when the two were in conflict, she chose work. It was not a decision she made lightly or without pain, but it was always the decision she made. They separated, and in May 1933, Joan filed for divorce, citing grievous mental cruelty, a standard legal formulation of the era that covered a range of real and inflated complaints. She claimed jealousy, frequent arguments, and a general incompatibility. The divorce was finalized. It had lasted just under 4 years. She was 27 years old and already on her second chapter. The next man she fell for came from a completely different world, and the relationship that followed was, by most accounts, the one she felt most deeply. It was also the one that would cost her the most, in the most private ways imaginable. The second marriage, Franchot Tone. Franchot Tone came from old money. He was the son of an industrialist from upstate New York, educated at Cornell University, and a man who had come to Hollywood not from necessity, but because acting was what he wanted to do, and he had the freedom to pursue it. He had been a founding member of the Group Theatre in New York, a serious, politically engaged company that produced some of the most important American drama of the Depression era, working alongside people like Lee Strasberg, Harold Clurman, and a generation of actors who believed the theatre should mean something beyond entertainment. Franchot Tone believed in the craft, with an earnestness that Joan Crawford found both admirable and eventually confounding. He was also not interested in being a star. He wanted to be an actor. The distinction was important to him, almost a point of principle. He was suspicious of the Hollywood star-making machinery in a way that someone who had arrived in the industry from desperation could never quite understand. For Joan, who had spent her entire adult life fighting to be a star, this was genuinely strange. She had worked for the thing he was indifferent to. They met on the set of Today We Live in 1933, the first of 7 films they would make together. The attraction was real and immediate. But there was a complication that is difficult to discuss without mentioning the woman at the center of it. Bette Davis had also been involved with Franchot Tone, and the competition between Crawford and Davis, which had been simmering since they first occupied the same professional space, intensified around him. Some accounts suggest that Joan's decision to pursue the relationship seriously was partly motivated by the desire to keep Tone away from Davis. Whatever the mixture of motivations, they married on October 11th, 1935, in New Jersey, in a relatively private ceremony that the press had been speculating about for months. What Tone brought into Joan's life was genuinely enriching in ways that the Fairbanks marriage had not been. He took her to the theatre and the opera, introduced her to literature and poetry, opened a cultural world that her Kansas City background had given her no access to. She was hungry for it, the hunger of someone who had always suspected there was more to life than what she had been allowed, and who finally had someone willing to show her. She adored him for it. She also worked hard during the marriage to advance his film career, lobbying MGM to give him better parts, using her influence on his behalf, trying to make the Hollywood machine accommodate a man who fundamentally didn't want to be accommodated by it. He was not interested in being a star, and nothing she did could make him interested. In 1937, Life magazine proclaimed Joan Crawford the first queen of the movies, a formal coronation of the status she had fought for. It was one of the highest public recognitions of her career, and Franchot Tone, as her husband, stood in the shadow of it. He reportedly found the position of being Mr. Crawford genuinely humiliating, not because of anything Joan did deliberately, but because of the simple arithmetic of their public profiles. She was considerably more famous than he was, and the entertainment industry, like most institutions, has its own particular cruelty toward the less famous member of a famous couple. There were also the losses. During the marriage, they tried twice to have children, and both pregnancies ended in miscarriage. Joan had wanted children, had wanted them with a genuine intensity that ran through her whole life, surfacing later in the adoptions and the complicated motherhood that followed. The losses during the Tone marriage were not footnotes. They were significant and painful, and they contributed to the atmosphere of a marriage that was, by the late 1930s, struggling from multiple directions at once. Tone's drinking worsened as the marriage deteriorated. Accounts from the period describe him becoming physically aggressive toward Joan during this time, behavior that she acknowledged in terms that were careful but clear. In 1938, the year that the marriage was effectively over in spirit, Joan Crawford was publicly branded box office poison, included in a list of Hollywood stars whose high salaries were not reflected in their ticket sales, published by the Independent Theatre Owners of America. It was the kind of industry humiliation that stuck. She was in her early 30s, her second marriage was falling apart. She had suffered 2 pregnancy losses, and the business that had been the foundation of her entire adult life was now publicly declaring her a liability. She proved them wrong within a year. The Women, a sharp, bitchy, all-female ensemble film released in 1939, showed a different side of her screen presence and was well received. But by then, the Tone marriage was over. She filed for divorce in February 1939, citing mental cruelty. The divorce was granted on April 11, 1939. It had lasted 3.5 years. She was in her early 30s, and this was her second failed marriage. The years that followed the Tone divorce were, professionally, the most extraordinary of her career. She left MGM in 1943 after 18 years, a mutually agreed departure that the studio framed as her decision and she framed as her own choice. She signed with Warner Brothers and fought against significant resistance from the director Michael Curtis for the role of Mildred Pierce. Curtis didn't want her. He made her do a screen test. He dismissed her as a has-been with shoulder pads. She was cast anyway. In 1946, she won the Academy Award for Best Actress for that performance, one of the great comeback narratives in Hollywood history. On the day of the ceremony, she had a genuine fever of 104 degrees and could not attend. She received the Oscar in her bed, at home. It remains one of the more characteristically Joan Crawford moments in her entire career. But even as that professional triumph was happening, she was already in her third marriage, one that had none of the depth of the Tone years, entered into for reasons she would later describe, without flattery to herself, as self-deception. And the man she had chosen, as she later admitted plainly, was someone she had convinced herself she loved. She hadn't. The third marriage, Philip Terry. Philip Terry was a working actor, handsome, decent, not especially famous, a graduate of the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London, who had found steady, if unremarkable, work in Hollywood. His poor eyesight made him exempt from military service during World War II, which was a factor in the calculus of who was available to meet and marry during wartime Hollywood, when a significant portion of the industry's male population had enlisted or been drafted. Joan had been introduced to him by a mutual friend in June 1942, and 6 weeks later they were married, at 10 minutes past midnight on July 21st, 1942, at the home of Joan's lawyer in the San Fernando Valley. They had known each other for 6 weeks. She later acknowledged, in her memoir, that she had persuaded herself it was love. It wasn't. That kind of honesty is striking and not easy to write about someone you married. But Joan Crawford, in the memoir years, had developed a particular willingness to be clear-eyed about her own motivations, at least in the cases where the truth served the narrative she was constructing of herself as someone who had learned from experience. She knew, perhaps even at the time, that the relationship didn't have the depth that the Fairbanks marriage had had in its early warmth, or the intellectual and emotional intensity of the Tone years. She had been alone for 3 years since the Tone divorce. 3 years of raising Christina, who had arrived in 1940, while managing a career that was in the process of its most significant reinvention. Alone was something Joan Crawford found genuinely difficult. She had never been someone who found solitude restful or clarifying. She needed people around her, needed movement, needed something to organize herself around. Philip Terry was there, and he was pleasant, and she chose him. During the marriage, she adopted a son, Christopher, in 1942. He was the second adopted child, following Christina in 1940. In April 1943, she and Terry adopted another son, initially named Philip Terry Jr., who was later renamed Christopher Crawford after the divorce. The family she was assembling through adoption was the family she had not been able to create through pregnancy. Each new child represented a real desire for the kind of home she had never had as a child, and had never managed to build as an adult. There was no great dramatic rupture in the Terry marriage. It didn't collapse under the weight of professional jealousy or drinking or physical aggression the way the Tone marriage had. It simply ran out of whatever it had been running on, which, by Joan's own admission, was not enough to begin with. By December 1945, they separated quietly. She filed for divorce in March 1946 on grounds of cruelty, claiming that Terry had treated her in a cruel and inhumane manner and inhibited her status as a movie star. It was the standard legal language of the era. The divorce was granted in April 1946. It had lasted 3 years and 10 months. She was completing Mildred Pierce during the final period of this marriage, working with a director who had fought against her casting and treated her badly on set, winning one of the most celebrated performances of her career, and filing for divorce, essentially simultaneously. On the night of the Academy Award ceremony, she was genuinely ill with a 104-degree fever and could not attend. The Academy Award for Best Actress was brought to her home, to her bedroom, where she received it in her bed. That particular image, the most prestigious prize in film delivered to a woman too sick to collect it in the middle of her third divorce, is one that says something about the specific texture of Joan Crawford's life in this period. After the divorce from Terry, 9 years passed before she married again. 9 years of being, for the first time in her adult life, genuinely on her own. Not briefly between marriages, but settled into a single life with her adopted children and her career. She adopted twin daughters, Kathy and Cynthia, in 1947, raising them alongside Christina and Christopher as a single mother. She worked consistently through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, through hits and through films that did not hit, through the continued evolution of her public persona from Depression-era working girl to something harder and more complex. By 1954, she had apparently concluded that marriage was not something she would try again. She said as much, in various forms, and then she met Alfred Steele at a party and concluded otherwise. What came next was, by her own account, the one marriage that had been worth all the others, and it was the only one that ended not with a lawyer, but with a morning she went to wake her husband and found him gone. The fourth marriage, Alfred Steele. Alfred Steele was not an actor. That, for Joan Crawford, was already something. He was a businessman, born in Nashville in 1901, educated at Northwestern University, a man who had spent his career in advertising and the soft drink industry, eventually becoming president and then chairman of the board of Pepsi-Cola. He had taken over the company in 1950 when it was a struggling second-place brand, running on the old slogan of offering twice as much for a nickel, essentially positioning itself as the poor man's Coca-Cola. Steele thought this was a liability and set about changing it. He travelled constantly, meeting bottlers personally, attending plant openings, building relationships with the people who actually made the product reach consumers. He understood that business was personal before it was anything else. Under his leadership, Pepsi's sales tripled. By the mid-1950s, for the first time, Pepsi was a genuine competitor to Coca-Cola rather than a distant also-ran. The achievement was real and was his. He and Joan had met briefly in 1950 and reconnected at a New Year's Eve party in 1954. By the time they met again, she knew who he was, and he knew who she was. A relationship developed that was, by the accounts of both parties and those around them, warm and mutually sustaining in a way that differed from anything Joan had described in the previous marriages. They had been planning a large, formal wedding in New Jersey, 600 guests, a proper ceremony, when, one evening in May 1955, Steele simply said, "Let's fly to Vegas tonight and get married." Joan said yes immediately. At 2:10 in the morning on May 10th, 1955, they were married in the penthouse suite of the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas with a borrowed ring because neither of them had thought to bring one, and Judge John Mendoza officiating. She was in her late 40s. He was 53. Neither of them was under any illusions about what they were doing or what they needed from each other. The marriage transformed her daily life in ways that none of the previous three had managed. She scaled back her acting commitments and began traveling the world with Alfred for Pepsi. Plant openings in Africa and Europe, bottler conferences across America, visits to newly established operations in the Middle East. For Joan Crawford, a woman who had been promoting herself since her Kansas City dance hall days, promoting Pepsi turned out to come naturally. She understood instinctively how to talk to people, how to make them feel that she was genuinely glad to see them, how to make an event feel significant. The bottlers and their wives responded to her. She was no longer just Joan Crawford, the movie star. She was Mrs. Steele, and she occupied that role with the same totality she had always brought to every role she played. She later wrote that, from the very beginning of the marriage, Alfred's company became their child, that they worked together and were stimulated by each other, out of mutual love and pride. She described him as the dead center of her life during those years. She described the period as the most blissful years she had known. Coming from a woman who had described her Academy Award-winning film career as the thing she had been born for, that is not a small or casual statement. They also renovated a large apartment in New York together, 2 units on the top floors of a building on East 71st Street, combined into one expansive home with Central Park views, rebuilt to Joan's exacting specifications. The renovation cost an estimated $400,000, much of it borrowed against future income and optimistic projections. It was extravagant in a way that would become a problem later. But in the moment, it was two people building a home together for the first time, rather than one person's house that the other person had moved into. On the morning of April 19th, 1959, Joan went to rouse Alfred for breakfast and found him on the floor beside the bed. She called the doctor immediately. She covered him in blankets. She kept telling him to get warm. The physician who came pronounced him dead of a massive heart attack. He was 57 years old, 5 days short of his 58th birthday. They had been married for less than 4 years. The financial reality that followed the death was harder than anyone outside the marriage had known. Alfred's estate was ultimately declared insolvent. A gross estate of over $600,000, offset by claims from the IRS, from his ex-wife, and from other parties, leaving Joan essentially without the financial security she had assumed the marriage would provide. She had also loaned Steele nearly $100,000 during the marriage from her own funds, which was listed as a claim against the estate but was unlikely to be recovered. 2 days after his death, she was elected to his vacancy on the board of directors of Pepsi-Cola, the first woman to serve on that board. She had no formal business qualification, but she had spent 4 years learning the company from the inside, and the board understood that her continued association with Pepsi was valuable to the brand. She served on the board for 14 years, until the incoming CEO Donald Kendall pushed her out in 1973. She kept working on screen through the 1960s. In 1962, she made Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, alongside Bette Davis, a film that was, in its production, as adversarial as anything in the legend of their rivalry, and that was also a genuine commercial success that gave both women late career visibility they had not had in years. She continued into horror films and television work, always maintaining the standard of dress and presentation that had been part of her public identity since the 1920s. Her final theatrical film was Trog in 1970. She retired from the screen after it. In 1978, the year after her death, her adopted daughter Christina published Mommy Dearest, a memoir describing a childhood of fear and harsh discipline under Joan's care. The book became a defining cultural document in discussions of Crawford's legacy. Some of her other children and many of her closest colleagues disputed elements of Christina's account. Others found it credible. Joan's will, signed in 1976, explicitly disinherited Christina and Christopher, leaving the bulk of her estate to Kathy and Cynthia, the younger twins. The reasons she gave were that Christina and Christopher knew why. She did not elaborate. What 4 marriages left behind. Joan Crawford died on May 10th, 1977, exactly 22 years to the day after she had married Alfred Steele in that penthouse suite in Las Vegas. She was found dead at her apartment in New York City of a heart attack, complicated by pancreatic cancer that had been progressing in the months before her death. She had given away her dog 2 days earlier because she could no longer care for it. Her last public appearance had been at a party honoring Rosalind Russell in New York in 1974. After that, she withdrew almost completely, closing the door on the public world that had defined her existence since she was 20 years old and had stepped off a train in California on New Year's Day, 1925, with borrowed money and a name that hadn't existed yet. She was cremated and her ashes placed in a crypt with Alfred Steele at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York. In death, she chose to be with the last husband, not beside any of the others. The 4 marriages, viewed together, trace a line through her life that is also a line through what she was looking for. and through the particular difficulty of being Joan Crawford while also trying to be someone's wife. Douglas Fairbanks Jr. offered her glamour and a name that could sit alongside her own rising one. But two young people who are both in the middle of constructing their public identities don't always have room for each other's private selves. The marriage was not deep enough, and when it met the career head-on, the career won. Franchot Tone offered her something she genuinely needed and had never had: intellectual companionship, a cultural world she had been excluded from, the specific warmth of someone who was interested in who she was as a person rather than what she looked like on a marquee. It was real, and it fell apart under the weight of his resentment of her success, the physical danger that came with his drinking, and the losses that neither of them was equipped to absorb together. Philip Terry offered stability and the simple fact of availability, and she chose him, as she admitted later, for reasons that were more about not wanting to be alone than about actual love. The marriage was thin from the start, and it stayed thin. And Alfred Steele offered her something she had never quite had in 40 years of adult life: a partner who matched her energy, who worked as hard as she did, who understood ambition and performance and public presence, because they were his own native languages too, and who didn't feel diminished by her success, because his success was entirely separate from hers. She wrote in her memoir that she had been fortunate enough to marry men who were well-educated and cultivated, with a love of good literature, good music, and all the fine arts. She also wrote that marriage was a learning experience, and that she had tried to learn from all of it, even when it hurt. Both of those things were true. She was also someone who chose, repeatedly, the wrong men for the right reasons. Someone whose capacity for love was real, but whose life left very little space for love to survive in. The women who came of age watching Joan Crawford on screen in the 1930s, the Depression-era audiences who watched her play working girls who found their way through talent and determination to something better, were watching a version of Joan Crawford's own story. Not the literal facts of it, but the emotional truth. A woman who had come from nothing and was going to make something of herself by any means necessary, in a world that had given her very little assistance. That woman was real, and she carried into her personal life the same drive and the same hunger and the same absolute insistence on her own primacy that had made her famous. It made her impossible to live with for 3 men, and finally possible to love for the 4th, in a way that she said was the best thing she had ever known. She left behind 4 adopted children, a 50-year career that spanned silent films and talkies and television, an Academy Award, a Pepsi-Cola board position, and a legend that has been complicated and contested ever since her death. She left behind the name Joan Crawford, a name she hadn't liked and hadn't chosen, and that she had worn for more than 50 years until it became, indisputably, hers. Whatever she was looking for across those 4 marriages, she came closest to it with Alfred Steele. She found it in her late 40s, lost it in under 4 years, and spent the rest of her life as a widow who kept showing up to Pepsi board meetings and movie sets and public appearances in the full knowledge that the best chapter had already ended. She was one of the most driven, most self-constructed, most complicated women in the history of Hollywood. She came from nothing, built everything, and held on to it through decades of effort that never really stopped. 4 marriages, 3 divorces, 1 loss, and a life that was, on its own imperfect and relentless terms, fully and completely lived. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.